You're listening to the VSL Aviation Podcast. I'm your host, Seth Lake, and this is episode 6. Thanks for listening. And if you're watching YouTube, thanks for watching. This is a YouTube channel as well as a podcast, at least for the most part, I think. At any rate, here in episode 6, we are back to task. Episodes 1 through 4, we covered the Private Pilot Airman Certification Standards. Episode 5 was kind of a special one. We talked about how to join the Air Force Reserves, and that was a discussion between me and one of my buddies, Josh. You can find out more about his channel in the comments here or on the podcast page, whatever podcast listener you're listening to, it'll be on there as well. But again, my name is Seth Lake. If you're first joining us, I am a designated pilot examiner. I also own a flight school that specializes in the multi-engine rating here in Russellville, Arkansas. And the reason I'm doing this show is to help people get ready for their check ride, really, because I feel like podcasts are a great way to do that, and YouTube channels as well. So if you're watching, that's great. In episodes 1 through 4, I started with the Private Pilot Airman Certification Standards, and just to kind of review, the ACS is basically the test that you're going to take at the end of your private pilot training. It's called a practical test, and so I ask you some questions in the beginning. That's the ground section, also known as the oral exam. Then we go and we do a flying portion of the exam where I ask you to do a series of maneuvers, and you have to demonstrate proficiency up to the ACS standards. So that's what the ACS is, and we spent 4 episodes talking about that. The reason I want to talk about it more is I think there are some skills in the ACS that deserve a little more attention, and we can kind of go into depth here on those. The first one that I wanted to break off and spend more time discussing is navigation. I think navigation is, first of all, it's really important as a pilot because 90% of the flying that you do as a pilot is probably going to be navigating somewhere. Once you're outside of training, which is a lot of not navigating, right? You're just flying out to a practice area and then flying back. Once you're done with that and have your license, a lot of you will go on to fly to different airports, right? That's probably one of the reasons why you became a pilot, is to go out and fly to these different places, and that involves navigation. So it's a really important skill to have, and it's also become really easy over the past few years with electronic flight bags like ForeFlight, which I'll be referring to those as EFBs as much as possible. I am a ForeFlight power user, for lack of a better term, I guess. Huge fan of ForeFlight. It is great, but it is just one of many electronic flight bags that are out there. So while this podcast is going to kind of center around ForeFlight, I'll try to talk about the other ones as much as I can, but I think ForeFlight is the most common one, and it's the one I would recommend if you were asking me personally. So the ACS talks about navigation in 2 different places. One of the places is we're going to cover during the oral, right? I'm going to have to see you have created a navigation log and planned a flight, and it's going to be some sort of scenario I give you. The scenario that I use is Russellville to Destin. That Russellville to Destin, Florida checks a lot of boxes that I need to evaluate on. So that's the scenario that I commonly ask for all of my applicants to plan for. But your examiner will probably ask for something different, obviously. At any rate, it'll be some sort of scenario, point A to point B type trip, and you have to get a navigation log together. That's covered in Area of Operation 1, Task D, which is cross-country flight planning. And this is the Private Pilot ACS. And so just as a quick review, there's 4 skills here. And basically, you need to prepare and present a flight plan. You need to take into consideration NOTAMs, stuff from the chart supplement, taxi and runway closures. You need to create a navigation flight plan and simulate filing a VFR flight plan. And then you need to recalculate fuel reserves based on a scenario provided by the evaluator. Those are the 4 skills you have to demonstrate on the ground, and those will be evaluated, again, before we even get to the airplane. Then, when we get to the airplane, I'm going to bring up my bookmark here. This is Area of Operation 6, which is Navigation, Task A, and it says it's titled Pilotage and Dead Reckoning. And there are 7 skills listed here. So the first one, prepare and use a flight log, navigate by pilotage. We're going to talk about all this here in a second, so hang with me. So navigate by pilotage. Navigate by means of pre-computed headings, ground speeds, and elapsed time. That's also known as dead reckoning. Use the magnetic direction indicator for navigation to include turns to headings. Verify position within 3 nautical miles of flight plan route. Arrive at the en route checkpoint within 5 minutes of the initial or revised ETA, and maintain the appropriate altitude plus or minus 200 feet, heading plus or minus 15 degrees. That is a very objective set of 7 standards. Notice that none of those mentioned the GPS. None of them mentioned ForeFlight or using the moving map. They just mentioned using pilotage and dead reckoning. It actually says dead reckoning in the title and in the knowledge area, but in the skill area, I noticed it doesn't say dead reckoning. It just defines it. So skill S3, that's basically the definition of dead reckoning. So what does this mean? How can you use this information in your Checkride? And what am I looking for as an examiner? So first of all, let's look where this is talked about in the, let me pull up the PHAK. We're in chapter 16 of the Pilot Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, and page 16-12 talks about pilotage, right? It defines pilotage as navigation by reference to landmarks or checkpoints. Okay, so we're using landmarks and checkpoints on the ground. And then if we go over a page, it talks about dead reckoning, which is navigation solely by means of computations based on time, airspeed, distance, and direction. So a real-world example of some amazing dead reckoning is when Charles Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic Ocean solo for the first time. He was using dead reckoning. There was no GPS. There was no radio beacons he was following. He computed a heading based on forecast winds, figured out a ground speed and time, and he flew that heading for a specified time until he ran into another continent. That is dead reckoning. So obviously we're not going to fly across the Atlantic during your Checkride, hopefully, but we are going to navigate a certain distance, and we're going to use a combination of pilotage and dead reckoning. Well, you should be planning on using a combination of pilotage and dead reckoning. What's happening more and more with the Checkrides I've noticed is you're relying on kind of ForeFlight and maybe a panel-mounted GPS, and you're saying, oh yeah, I can definitely navigate, but that doesn't meet the requirement of the ACS. And so, remember, I used this last podcast, and I kind of like the analogy. When you show up to the Checkride, it's like showing up to a roller coaster ride. You've got the you must be higher than line on a roller coaster, right? And you never want to be just the exact height to ride the ride. You want to be head and shoulders above that line, so there's no question, yes, I am big enough, I'm tall enough to ride this ride. Well, when you show up for your private pilot check ride, you need to show up with confidence knowing that, hey, I don't care if my DP wants me to dead reckon my way across the Atlantic Ocean. I am ready, and I'm not just solely dependent on my ForeFlight, my iPad working, or this GPS in the plane working. So you want to be completely prepared for that. So let's talk about how you can use ForeFlight to help you meet those requirements for pilotage and dead reckoning and the navigation log that are outlined here in the ACS. So I'm going to jump back to the ACS, and we're going to focus on the oral part first. So the ground part, that was the cross-country or pre-flight preparation, preparing a Navlog in cross-country. How are we going to do that? So I've got my iPad here. I've got the screen recording. That was a bad sound. I've got my screen recording going, so I'm going to pull this up. It's available on the YouTube channel if you want to watch there, or if you want to follow along at home. It should be pretty simple. So in Chapter 16, where it talks about navigation, I'm just going to give a real high-level view. Read Chapter 16. It's going to go into detail all the requirements it takes for you to plan and execute across country. So first off, I'm going to use my example of Russellville to Destin. So I've got my 2 points in there, and this gives me a nice kind of, call it a 40,000-foot view of the route. I know that it's going to be 443 nautical miles. It's going to take 2 hours and 53 minutes, and how much fuel. So at this point, this isn't really enough information for me to do a cross-country plan on. because I don't have any checkpoints, right? I need to have en route checkpoints probably every 15 to 20 nautical miles, so I can kind of update myself on, hey, how is this going along? Do I have a greater tailwind or a greater headwind than a forecast? Maybe I set a different power setting and my power setting is throwing off my timing, but I need to have these checkpoints. And right, that meets the requirement for the definition of pilotage and dead reckoning I've got a series of checkpoints. And these checkpoints don't just need to be arbitrary points, they need to be points that I can identify from the air. So I've got the sectional pulled up on ForeFlight right now, and I've got my straight line going to Destin, Florida. And as I zoom in, I can use the measurement tool where you put both fingers on the iPad screen at the same time, and it'll give you a distance measuring. And I can kind of see around 11 miles to the southeast of Russellville, there's an airport. Well, airports are excellent visual checkpoints because they're easily identifiable from the air. At night, they typically have beacons, right? They might have pilot-controlled lighting that we can activate to see where they're at. So they make excellent checkpoints. If I can fly directly over an airport, that's usually what I'm going to do. Now, you want to be careful on what kinds of airports you choose, right? I might not choose a Class Bravo airport, but in the case of our example here, this is Petit Airport. Excuse the pronunciation, my French listeners. This is Arkansas, and we pronounce it Petit. But the Petit Airport is basically a Class Echo or Class Golf airport, Class Golf at the surface. So if we're flying it over at 3,000 or 4,000 feet, we're not going to be bothering anybody in that airspace, and it's going to be really easy to see. So that might be my first checkpoint. I've got a couple options of how I can save this to ForeFlight. I can simply use the rubber band method, and that's where I place my finger on the point and I release. It should pull up a menu that has nearby waypoints, and it also has at the very top a custom waypoint. And I can just tap more, and I can save or insert to route. So what I could do right here is insert this into my route, and then I can tap on that point right there and save it. And I can give this a name, and I'm just going to call it Petit Jean. Petit Jean. Sorry, everybody complains about that as a name. Can't have any spaces. Okay, there we go. So now I've named that custom waypoint. So that's my checkpoint number 1. That one was pretty easy. The next one might be a little more difficult, right? I'm looking out at 15 to 20 miles, and I'm just not seeing any airports. There is a small private field. Private fields, in my experience, aren't good checkpoints because a lot of times they are just grass strips and they blend in with their surrounding areas, and they're pretty easy to miss. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to turn off user waypoints here. So we're looking at the sectional here, and I have this rule when I'm choosing checkpoints called the rule of 3. That's what I call it anyway. I want 3 things that are guiding me to this checkpoint. So for instance, I don't want to just pick a road bend, right? But a road bend with a bridge and a tower nearby it, those are 3 things. That would be an excellent checkpoint. So I start looking in the general vicinity of my 10 to 15 mile point, and I'm seeing some really good things. So I see some roads. Those thin gray lines are roads. The thicker the gray line, the busier the road. So that really matters more at night. So you can expect more car lighting to happen on a really thick gray road than a really thin gray road. And then there's a lot of roads, if you look outside, there's a lot of roads that aren't listed on the sectional. And so what the FAA has determined is those roads are, they're not reasonably busy enough to be, or big enough to be visible from the air. So typically these are just paved roads that are listed on there. Sometimes they have highway marking signs. Sometimes they don't. The big interstates will typically have a marking sign, like here, if you're following along again on ForeFlight, you can see I-40 is actually marked with a 40. while these other roads aren't really listed. So if you're somebody local that knows them, it might be helpful. But as a pilot, though, these roads are just things that we can maybe see from the air, have a reasonable expectation to see. So we're looking for our checkpoint that's going to meet our rule of 3. So I see there's the Conway Airport out here that's kind of abeam us. There's also a big river, that's the Arkansas River, as well as a smaller kind of creek or stream, and then a set of railroad tracks. So that right there at Conway, that really meets a bunch of marks, right? I've got a kind of northeast to southwest rung of the river with a set of railroad tracks, an airport, and a stream. And there's also a road over here. So that's going to be a really good checkpoint. I might put my checkpoint right there. I'm just going to add it there. And whenever I'm going to beam that Conway Airport, that's when I'll stop my stopwatch because I'm going to time each of these legs. Now, I also can use the Conway Airport as a bracketing feature or a funneling feature. So it can become kind of like those bumper guards when you go bowling when you're a kid. If I'm at the Conway Airport, if I'm flying over it, I know I'm too far north of course, and I need to make a correction back to the south to get back to course. I've got another great bracketing feature down here to the south. I've got this lake here. It's labeled Lake Maumelle, and there's a bridge and a dam going across the westernmost point of that lake. So that lake will be really easy to see. So if I'm to the south of that lake, that's my southern bracket. So I've got a northern bracket and a southern bracket. That's going to keep me in between my courses, and so those are going to be really useful. Now, during a check ride, how would I use this? Well, I know the check ride limit is 3 miles, right? I have to be able to keep myself within 3 miles of my pre-computed course line. So I know that if I stay north of this tip of the lake, and if I stay inside of the Arkansas River there, which the river is going to be really easy to see, that's 2.5 miles. So I know I'm not going to be off course beyond the limits of the ACS. So I've got those first 2 points figured out. You would just continue that process on throughout your route to find checkpoints, again, about every 20 nautical miles. And you want to make sure, again, you're using some sort of methodology where you're picking points out that are easy for you to see from the air. All right, and the best way is to use that rule of 3 that we just talked about. Okay, so we have all of our checkpoints listed. We're going to simulate that we've done that. Obviously, on a trip like the one we have, a 400 nautical mile trip, you're going to have a lot of visual checkpoints along the route of flight. So if you look at the ACS, it really just says you have to plan all that to your first fuel stop. So a lot of cases, people will plan a fuel stop in Meridian, Mississippi, or somewhat halfway point. So that'll decrease the amount of planning that you need to do. And realistically, in the check ride, what I'm going to do is ask you to explain your cross-country flight plan, and we'll talk about the first few checkpoints. And all I'm doing there is like, hey, did this pilot pick out checkpoints that can be identified by the air? Are they marked appropriately on either the paper sectional or ForeFlight? And yes, I do accept both. I think a lot of examiners do. We accept both ForeFlight and paper-based planning. In fact, kind of a quick rabbit trail here, I would rather see you come in using an electronic flight bag, because I think in this day and age, it's just it's obvious that you're going to go on to plan 90% of your flights using electronic flight bag of some sort, either ForeFlight, Garmin Pilot, WingX, whatever. Because A, it's really simple. B, it's very accessible, right? You don't have to have an exorbitant amount of money to get an iPad and load ForeFlight or Garmin Pilot on it. And the third reason, it's what I call sustainable. So it's really sustainable because it's easy. But before, when you're having to plan everything out on paper using a sectional and a paper Navlog and do a bunch of calculations with the E6B and a plotter to really plan a cross-country flight with pilotage dead reckoning, it took a long time, right? Each flight, just in the planning, would take probably upwards of an hour at least when you're proficient at it. And so it was just really difficult to do that. Most people didn't. They would just file IFR, which IFR is a different planning process. It's actually a little bit easier, right? I don't have to make pencil marks picking out checkpoints every 20 miles to go out and do an IFR check ride or a IFR flight. So now that ForeFlight's available, it makes that process a lot easier. And so I think that's the sustainable way people are going to use throughout their career. So I would much rather evaluate you kind of in your natural state of affairs of using the system that you're going to use the rest of your career than evaluate you using a system that you've never used before or that you'll never continue to use. So if it turns into almost like a circus trick, right? Where you're showing me you know how to plan using paper-based methods, but then in reality, you're never going to go out and actually use those paper-based methods. So it's not a very realistic way to plan. At any rate, that's my thought process on how to evaluate this. The problem I run into is the EFBs are so easy that a lot of my applicants don't understand the underlying skills or the underlying fundamentals of how ForeFlight is calculating this route. So that's the piece that if you show up with the ForeFlight navigation log and flight plan to your check ride with me, we're going to have a discussion about what are those underlying principles. And a couple of the big ones are deviation and variation. ForeFlight doesn't do a great job in its Navlog of pulling those up. So real quick, I'm going to, the flight plan we just did, I'm going to send to flights, and I'm going to pull up the Navlog. And so that's the easiest way to pull that up in ForeFlight is start in your maps page, put in all your waypoints, make sure that your aircraft type is correct, make sure that your performance profile is correct, choose your altitude, and make sure your departure time is correct. So you want to make sure all of those things are correct on your maps page so you're getting the proper output. So, computer systems, including ForeFlight, they're not magic, right? I can't feed them bad data and expect them to produce good data, right? If I feed them bad data, they're going to give me a perfectly incorrect answer. So I want to make sure that the data that I input is correct. And so in this case, we want to make sure our aircraft type, our performance profile for that aircraft, the altitude, and our time of flight are all what we want it to be. They're all correct. If I choose anything that's, over 24 hours out, it's going to give me, it should give me a 0 wind because it doesn't know the wind out that far. So it's just going to put a line through the wind. And so now it's going to give me a warning, and it's going to say, your estimated time of departure wind forecast is unavailable. We're going to use 0 for the wind and temperatures. So that's good to know. So we're going to make it current, and we're going to hit the little share button, and we're going to share it with our flights tab. And our flights tab now has the navigation log that we want. Notice our maps tab also has a nav log, but that nav log is something different. I wish ForeFlight would call it something else because it's sort of like a nav log, but it's really kind of a real-time progression log. It's kind of a status log, not a true nav log. So on our flights page, that's where the true nav log is, and that should look very similar to the old school kind of paper nav logs that you fill out. Now, looking at these headings, the table that lists all of our points, it lists our winds and our magnetic heading and our course. Those are all things in Chapter 16 that we learn about that you need to know what they mean. But it also leaves some stuff out, like our magnetic variation and our magnetic deviation. It doesn't talk about either of those. In fact, it's accounting for magnetic variation. It doesn't tell you that anywhere, but it is accounting for variation. But it's not accounting for deviation. It's not accounting for that because deviation is specific to the airplane that you're flying. The compass card, which is it's a required item in the airplane. It should be somewhere around your magnetic compass. That compass deviation card tells us what the deviation for that specific airplane is. A lot of times it'll even specify if it has the radios on or radios off. So it's very specific. ForeFlight doesn't know that information, so it doesn't give it to us. I kind of wish they would add an empty column in there that we could go in and write that in, but that would be something I would expect to see from an applicant during a check ride. At minimum, I expect you to know, hey, this Navlog does not account for my deviation. That's something I'm responsible for, and when I get in the airplane, I'm going to have to account for that. We're also going to have a discussion about how, what's the difference between my heading and my course? Why are those two not the same? And the answer is wind. Wind is the reason my heading and course are going to be different. I'll also have magnetic variation in there as well, because there's a difference between my true course and my magnetic course, and that's determined by my isogonic lines that can be found on the sectional. In some parts of the country, they're negligible. Like around here, they're only 1 degree. Sometimes they're 0 degrees. In other parts of the country, in the world, they can make a great deal of difference. They might be 15, 25, 40 degrees difference at the northern latitudes. That's pretty uncommon, but it can be that high. And so knowing how to find magnetic variation on the chart on the sectional, that'll be something that I ask during the oral exam of the check ride. I'll ask, well, how do you find variation, and what is it? Like, how do we use it? I'll also ask you, where do you find your winds law forecast? Because guess what? ForeFlight may not always be up. Maybe your flight planning and your iPad dies. Well, if the only way you know how to check winds aloft is on ForeFlight, then you're kind of in a sticky situation, right? You don't have ForeFlight, so if you have internet access, how are you going to get that? You might have to call flight service station and say, hey, I'd like the winds aloft for these 3 airports, and pencil and paper write down the winds aloft for the altitudes that you're wanting. But you need to have some sort of plan and idea of how to get that information without using ForeFlight. All right, so that's how you're going to prepare and present a navigation log. It would be best to have this printed out. You can send this to a printer, so you can just hit the share button again, and you can print it off. You can save it to ForeFlight documents, and have it prepared where you have an all digital kind of folder, navigation folder that you present to me as an examiner. That would be fine. There's nothing in the ACS that says it has to be on paper, so it can be fully digital. But you need to have an idea of how you're going to back up this information. So if your iPad dies, and on a check ride, it will probably die. It'll probably die, or it'll probably overheat. You need to have a valid backup plan. If that backup plan's another iPad, perfect. That's a great way to mitigate that risk. In fact, ForeFlight makes this even easier for us. We have some built-in checklists in ForeFlight. One of those is the EFB pre-flight checklist. So this EFB pre-flight checklist, it starts with charging. Your primary iPad is charged, your secondary iPad's charged, and your iPhone is charged. Other portables charged, backup battery charged, and you have charging cables. So you can already tell that ForeFlight kind of wants you to have those backups. They don't want you to rely on just one iPad, because they realize that, hey, these aren't perfect pieces of technology. They fail, they overheat, they lose their charge. Any number of reasons can make you use one of your secondaries, so you need to have those done. So going through this EFB pre-flight checklist, this would make me so excited if I've only seen a couple of applicants do this, but this would make me really excited as an examiner to see this level of preparation on the part of one of my applicants. Because if they know about this checklist and they've abided by it, and they have a secondary iPad and an iPhone, and I don't expect everybody to have 2 iPads, but having ForeFlight on your iPhone, that's also a valid backup, right? I would totally accept that as an examiner. I think most examiners would. I think most examiners should, because if your iPhone is charged and it has the requisite charts loaded on it, and ForeFlight, then yeah, that's a totally legal way for you to, and it's also a safe way for you to pull up and have access to that data. And maybe your plan is, okay, well, now my iPad's died. I'm going to go ahead and I might even need to land a little bit earlier than I thought. especially if I'm dealing with challenging weather at all, and that iPad is really critical to me continuing this flight as planned. Now, if your iPad is that critical of you continuing, you need to have a backup, right? You need to have a backup for it. Either a backup iPad or everything loaded on your iPhone. And most of the features on ForeFlight that you have on the iPad, you're also going to have on your iPhone. All right, so that pretty much covers how we're going to cover the ground. So your ground preparation, you're looking at that information. The other thing I would expect you to be able to pull up is your briefing tab in your flights tab. Now, most people have seen this, hopefully. This is really good for weather planning, but it also makes sure that I have downloaded all of the NOTAMs for my departure, en route, and arrival to include runway closures, taxiway closures. Those are all included in that briefing tab. So making sure you hit the briefing button, go through line by line all those items in the briefing before you show up to your Checkride, be able to speak to them. That is critical. The last thing on there is recalculate fuel reserves based on a flight planning scenario by the evaluator. So looking down here, I can see my fuel weights, and I can see how much reserve fuel I have. So I could quickly throw out some numbers and just have a working knowledge, knowing that, hey, I've got X number of extra gallons on this flight. So if you ask me to divert, and it's this distance, it's going to take this amount of fuel. So rough estimate, I'm going to have 10 gallons of extra fuel. Or I would be able to answer in the negative saying, no, I can't divert to that location because I don't have enough fuel. I'd have to find another place to divert to. But we're going to ask some sort of question that's going to force you to recalculate your fuel required and fuel reserves. All right. Now we're done with the oral part, looking at the navigation part for the actual flight. We go out to the airplane. This is what we're going to have to do in the aircraft. Prepare and use a flight log, navigate by pilotage, and navigate by means of pre-computed headings, ground speeds, and elapsed time. So that's where we kind of come full circle here. The stuff that we did on the ground now becomes critical to our success in the air, because we're going to have to use this navigation log that we prepared and talked about on the oral. We're going to have to use that in flight. So now you're going to have to fly from point A to point B using a pre-computed heading, ground speed, and elapsed time, and arrive at an en route checkpoint, right, that you can identify from the air within 5 minutes and within 3 nautical miles. So we're going to have to use those bracketing features, those easily identifiable features that are on the ground. We're going to have to use all that to make sure we arrive at our waypoint when we want to arrive at our waypoint. So if our first checkpoint here is Petit, I'm going to start the stopwatch. Usually there's a timer on the transponder. I might use the timer on my ForeFlight. Might use a wrist stopwatch, but I'm basically going to hack a watch when we release the brakes on the runway. And I expect you to get to that first checkpoint or second checkpoint within the requirements listed here using pilotage and dead reckoning, right? I'm not expecting you to go direct to function on the 430 or 650 and fly direct to Petit using the onboard GPS. That doesn't meet the requirements of the ACS. I expect you to be able to take off and navigate there using pilotage and dead reckoning only, and get yourself in the right spot. So let's talk about how we would do that in the airplane. Well, if I take off from Russellville and I'm going to Petit Airport, immediately I call these funneling features. So one of my big funneling features is the Arkansas River, right? The Arkansas River, if I'm turning and I'm going to the southeast, well, I see the river is kind of in general going to the southeast as well. So if I just follow the river, that's going to get me really close to my checkpoint. So if I keep following the river to the east, eventually I'm going to get to a point where the airport and the river are really close. They're only maybe less than 2 miles away from the river is the center of mass of the Petit Airport. So I can use that as kind of a funneling feature. And then I also have, I can use the river as a bracketing feature, right? If I get real far south of the river, I'm going to run into another road down here that's running parallel with a railroad track. So that's my bracketing feature to the south. If I run into that railroad and road, I know I'm way too far south. And really, I don't want to get that far away. I don't want to get more than 2 miles south of the river. As long as I maintain 2 miles south of the river, I'm going to meet the ACS requirement. I'm going to get there within 3 nautical miles, and I'm going to get there within my 5 minutes. 5 minutes is a long time, guys. If it's taking you 7 minutes to navigate there, let's say, you've got plus or minus 5 minutes on either side of that, according to the ACS standards. That's a lot of time. You can get there within that ETA without a problem at all. So don't stress too much about that. The thing that I would focus on is making sure that you pick out good checkpoints that are easily identifiable from the air. I cannot say that enough. You don't want to pick out just some random road, some random spot in the road. There's no way for me to objectively say, yes, we're at that waypoint, because I don't even know where that point is. You just picked a point along the road. So use that rule of 3 to pick that point. The other thing is using your magnetic compass to turn to these headings. So what I'll probably do is I'll probably turn location services off on your iPad. That way you can still use your iPad, but it's effectively just an electronic sectional. It doesn't have your ship position displayed on the iPad, so you can't cheat using that. But you can use the iPad for the purposes of a sectional. The other thing that I'll do is if your plane's equipped with a 430 or 650, some sort of panel-mounted GPS, or even a portable GPS, what I'll do is I'll take that to a screen that's just useless. So you're not able to see, again, your ship position in reference to a map. That's just for the navigation section right here. Because if we go over here to the navigation systems, the next part that we're going to evaluate, it says that you're able to use an airborne electronic navigation system. So it's not that I'm not going to let you use the GPS in the plane. It's quite the opposite. I'm going to have you use the GPS in the plane, but I'm not going to let you use it for the purpose of this of task A, which is pilotage and dead reckoning. Like I said, in I think it was episode 2 or 3, where I'm talking about this in the ACS review, I'm typically going to have you use the GPS during the diversion scenario. So we're going to use pilotage and dead reckoning to navigate to our first 1 or 2 checkpoints, and then I'm going to have you to divert, and when I have you divert, that's when I'm going to say, okay, I want you to use the 430 to divert to this airport over here. So that's how that's going to flow in the Checkride with me anyway. I think a lot of examiners are going to do something similar to that, because we're all faced with the same problem of we've got all of these things we need to evaluate in a shorter time as practical. So we want to be as efficient as possible when we're doing this. So we're not going to have you fly one cross-country, then go back to the airport, and then fly another cross-country using the GPS. We're going to combine, not combine activities, but we're going to get as many activities done as efficiently as possible. I think that's the best way to put that. Okay, so we've talked about what the ground is going to look like versus what it's going to look like in flight, and how you're going to use ForeFlight to accomplish those and make your examiner happy. Which isn't, I hate to say it that way, because I feel like that creates a lot of frustration in the pilot community, is if you feel like there's certain examiners that want it one way and there's examiners that want it another way. And I'll give you that. I think that us as the examiner community could do better in maybe coordinating or providing that standard. I mean, the standard is the ACS. But the ACS is vague in a lot of different ways, and so you could very well run into an examiner that interprets it different than another examiner, and we're just lacking a little bit of standardization. I see that a lot, especially when I compare it to the Air Force community. So I was an examiner in the Air Force, for instance, and there was a lot more purposeful examiner standardization in the Air Force, down to the Air Force base that you were at and you were an examiner at. They had things that they did very specifically to that base. And when you did it at a different base, it might be slightly different, but at least everybody at that location were doing their check rides pretty much the same way. They had the same profiles, and you knew what to expect a lot more than going into a Checkride in the civilian world where this DPE might have a slight different view on this area of operation than another DPE. And so what I'm trying to do with this podcast is give you as much information as possible, because I can't tell you how to read the mind or tell you how other examiners are interpreting this, but I can tell you what my honest interpretations are and what the black and white letter of the law says for the Airman Certification Standards, and help you understand the ACS a little bit more. Because I honestly think that if you prepare like I'm telling you to prepare for in the ACS, no matter what examiner you go to, you're going to be in a good situation. They're going to like the product that you give them, and they're not going to have any issues at all. So that's my honest opinion. If you're out there taking a check ride and you listened to all this and you did it the way that I asked, and the examiner still didn't like the way that you did it, I'd really like to talk to that examiner. I'd like to see what their thoughts are there. At any rate, another little rabbit trail. My apologies. That covers our navigation on the ground and navigation in the air for the purposes of a check ride for the private pilot. We will probably talk about this in the commercial ACS whenever I get to that. There's a couple of more episodes that I want to do, kind of deep dives of the private pilot events, and then we'll get into the next chapter of things, whatever that might be, for the podcast and channel. At any rate, I hope you found this useful, and if you have, let me know. If I could have done something better, let me know. You can contact me at seth@vsl.aero is the best email to catch me at. I'm going to share this on Facebook. Of course, if you want to leave a comment in YouTube, I'll try to address that as well. I am just one person. I'll try to address as many as I can, but I'm pretty busy. So if it takes a few days or a week for me to respond, please be patient. But that is all I have for today. Hope you found it useful, and I will see you next time. Thanks for listening.